Good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Zimmerman. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. Unfortunately, I live in Victoria on the south of Vancouver Island in the Pacific Ocean, and I have to teach at 8:30 tomorrow morning Pacific time, so it just wasn't feasible to get to Churchill College. But I want to talk to you today about a topic that is dear and true to my scholarship. In fact, I've written a number of books in regards to this topic, which involves, of course, A.V. Hill, the subject of today's symposium, and his good friend, Sir Henry Tizard, and the mobilization of British scientists for war in 1939-1940. Hill and Tizard were both starting out their scientific careers, Hill at Cambridge, Tizard at Oxford. Tizard was a physical chemist when the First World War began in 1914. Both men were fortunate that they weren't sent to the front, as many other young scientists were, and some of those young scientists died. Hill stayed behind to teach musketry. Tizard joined the Royal Flying Corps and was given a ground job at Uphaven Air Base, where they trained pilots for the expanding Royal Flying Corps. And by 1915, as the war was nowhere near ending, as many people thought it would have been in 1914, it was clear that science had a role to play in determining the outcome of the war. And Britain very slowly began to mobilize its scientific resources. Hill was asked to lead a group of scientists and mathematicians to place the new gunnery of anti-aircraft artillery on a scientific footing. Hill's bandits, as they were called, did pioneering work in improving anti-aircraft weaponry, as well as early acoustical aircraft detection methods, as you can see here. Tizard, on the other hand, took it upon himself to learn how to fly in order to be able to study aeronautics, because he understood that aircraft performance could only be improved by close scientific evaluation of what made aircraft fly efficiently at all different altitudes. One of Tizard's biggest works was improving the chemistry of aviation fuel for aircraft, and he tested aviation fuel, particularly at high altitudes, which were necessary to fight German Zeppelins and German bombers. By the end of the First World War, both Hill and Tizard had great success in their scientific endeavors, but it was a bitter success because both men were convinced that Britain had not mobilized its science effectively. It hadn't done so right away, and even when it had been mobilized, there was too much opposition to their work. And so both men were convinced that in the future, if there ever would be another war, that science must be mobilized to support the nation as soon as a war commenced, if not before. In the 1920s, Hill, of course, became a famous scientist, winning the Nobel Prize, a member of the Royal Society. And one of the important aspects of this, for what I'm talking about today, is after he won the Nobel Prize, he was a famous scientist, and he was able to travel to the United States a number of times and develop close connections with some American scientists and academic leaders. Tizard, on the other hand, realized he would never be a great scientist and stayed in the civil service, where he rose very quickly in the ranks, becoming basically Britain's chief civil service scientist as the principal secretary of the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. Tizard would become a member of the Royal Society as a result himself in the mid-1920s. And he left, though, this civil service in the late 1920s to become the rector of Imperial College. However, for Tizard, he stayed within government science, particularly as a member of the Aeronautical Research Committee, which oversaw developments in aviation and government-funded research. And Tizard, by the mid-1930s, was in fact the chairman of the ARC. When Hitler came to power. Both Hill and Tizard very quickly involved in the efforts to mobilize British science for war. Now, Hill's first major work in this was, in fact, that he determined very early on that Hitler was a fundamental threat to scientific freedom and inquiry. The dismissal by the Nazis as early as April 1933 of almost 2,000 German scientists and other university scholars because of their perceived racial heritage, because they were Jewish or had Jewish grandparents, or in a few cases because of their political views, mobilized Hill to action. And Hill made some of the earliest speeches condemning Adolf Hitler and said to the British scientific community, we must mobilize in response to this threat to everything we hold dear. And Hill was one of the founding members of the Academic Assistance Council, which assisted academic refugees in Great Britain. This is the announcement of the council's formation in May 1933. And you can see Hill's name figured with the other scientists and scholars that supported the AAC from the very beginning. Hill remained on the executive of the AAC and involved in its successor agency, the Society for the Protection of Science and Learning, for the rest of his life. And it's amazing how much time Hill devoted to helping displaced scholars find refuge in the 1930s. However, both Hill and Tizard were drawn into developments in military scientific research in 1934. In October 1934, Hill was asked by Henry Wimpress, who you can see illustrated here on the left, about the possibility of the use of death rays. Wimpress, the director of scientific research at the Air Ministry, was trying to resolve the problem of whether or not they could stop the bombers from getting through, as Stanley Baldwin had said, and could in any way defend London and other British cities from aerial bombardment. Hill was asked because as a physiologist, physiologists have been involved in using infrared rays and high frequency sound waves to study their effects on animals, and killed many a specimen. I don't know if Hill was involved in that particular sort of research, but he's certainly familiar with it. And so Wimpress asked Hill, can we build death rays? And Hill's response to that, well, I don't know, but I think if it's going to work at any range, it has to be shortwave radio. And I suggest you talk to Robert Watson-Watt, who's the British government's leading expert on radio. This led to a discussion between Wimpress and Robert Watson-Watt, and led directly to the Daventry experiments in February 1935, after Watson-Watt had dismissed the idea of death rays, but had suggested that he had observed on a regular basis the interference of aircraft to his shortwave testing of the height of the ionosphere, and suggested that they might be able to develop technology using reflection of radio waves from aircraft to be able to locate accurately aircraft at great distances. And very quickly, in 1935, aircraft were being detected by the new technology we know today as radar at ranges of up to 60 miles. At the same time that Watson-Watt was beginning to develop his experiment, the Air Ministry determined that they needed a scientific investigation into the problems of air defense to make sure that all possible avenues of scientific research were being explored vigorously. And the new Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defense, the Air Ministry turned to Henry Tizard to be chair. He was, after all, a highly experienced government scientist. He was now the chair of the Aeronautical Research Committee. And so he became chair of the committee, and it's named after him as the Tizard Committee. Supporting Tizard's work would be Hill, probably after Tizard, the most qualified person to undertake this work. And then joining them, the brilliant young physicist Patrick Blackett, who's here in the center. And Blackett's connection to this he was actually a naval officer during the First World War. He switched over to a university career in the 1920s. So he had a great deal of experience in both the scientific world and the military. Hoisted, though, upon Tizard and the others was a man you see in the forefront of the picture on the upper right, Frederick Lindemann. Lindemann, professor of physics at Oxford University, had been friends with Tizard, where they both had met in Germany while studying there prior to the First World War. The two men had had a falling out in the 1920s, but the important thing about Lindemann and why he was put on the committee was because of his friendship to Winston Churchill. You can see standing next to Lindemann here. Churchill, a thorn in the side of the British government, demanding action to rearm Britain as quickly as possible, had been creating politically embarrassing comments, questions, statements, both in public and in the House of Commons, and was hoped by putting his friend Lindemann on this committee, it might quiet him down. The chair of the committee was A.P. Rowe, a government scientist, Air Ministry scientist, who would become an important wartime scientist leading the Air Ministry's radar research program from 1938 until the end of the war. So they began to examine all sorts of different approaches to air defense research. Very quickly, they realized that radar was probably the single most important development. And Tizard and Hill and Blackett wished to promote radar as much as possible. Unfortunately, Lindemann had other ideas. Lindemann did think that radar had its use, but he did not think it was the solution to the air defense dilemma. And he advocated for a variety of technologies, perhaps most famously or infamously, the aerial minefield or the parachute bombs. Now, this was actually a research project that was being undertaken at Farnborough. And the attempt was to develop a very small bomb attached to a long wire, which itself was attached to a parachute. And somehow these were to be launched. In front of an approaching aircraft formation, which would then wrap themselves around the wings, the wires, the bombs would explode, and the plane would be shot down. However, the tests on this technology were, not surprisingly, not very promising, but Lindemann demanded that it was because of the lack of effort. And the result of this was the committee basically was paralyzed by Lindemann, who refused to agree to anything until they followed his agenda. Beginning in May until September 1936, the work of the committee was paralyzed until finally in the summer, Hill and Blackett both resigned, telling the Air Minister that if they had to do so, because Tizard's health was being ruined by Lindemann's constant and often verbally violent objections. As a result, the Air Minister dissolved the Tizard Committee, and then on the 2nd of September 1936 reformed it with Tizard, Hill, and Blackett, again as members, but with Professor Appleton replacing Lindemann, who was left back out in the wilderness. When that problem was finally settled, Tizard did what was probably his most important single experiments, and he began to work with Air Force officers on how the information that they hoped to receive from radar, and it's important to note that this was being done before radar technology had been developed, to take the information they expected to get and to figure out how they could use it using existing technologies to direct fighter aircraft to intercept bomber formations, hopefully right at the coastline of Great Britain. As a result of this, research, Tizard realized very quickly, and really trained RAF officers to understand this, that the real way to achieve successful interception was to develop clarity and simplicity in the information that was being received. Radar would return vast amounts of information on approaching aircraft. So how could you get this information easily displayed? were displayed on a simple map, such as the one seen here. And this would allow the controllers on the ground using radio direction finding to direct fighters to their targets. While working out the best approach to doing this, Tizard developed what became known in the RAF as the Tizzy angle. It was an example of simplicity, which abandoned a mechanical means of calculating the course to steer fighters to an intercept. Instead, Tizard suggested using an imaginary isosceles triangle on the map between the fighters and the bombers to quickly get a reasonable, accurate intercept course. A reasonably well-trained interception officer could make those very approximate calculations in their head, give orders to the fighters in which approximate direction to steer, and then, when necessary, correct their direction of flight as more information came in. This was an amazingly important contribution and ultimately was key once radar stations were built in sufficient numbers, so that when the war started, Britain had the most sophisticated information processing system in the world. And this was the British air defense system based upon radar, which allowed Britain to defeat the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. If this wasn't enough, both Hill and Tizard were closely connected to the mobilization of all British scientists for war. In 1938, Tizard won permission from the Air Ministry to begin to brief civilian scientists so that when war started, civilian scientists would know exactly what was the state of ongoing, cutting-edge, and top-secret military scientific research. The first man Tizard briefed was the physicist John Cockcroft. And once Cockcroft was educated on radar, his job was to then find other civilian scientists, particularly the younger generation of scientists, who could be sent for brief introductory courses on radar to the Bodsey experimental establishment where radar was being developed. Meanwhile, Hill, as well as Tizard, working with Sir William Henry Bragg, the president of the Royal Society, also began to compile a comprehensive list of all British scientists. This would mean that when Britain went to war, scientists would not be drafted into the military, but in fact would be available for conducting the research that their skills really were best suited for. As well, both Tizard and Hill were absolutely convinced that the best way to effectively utilize military science for the military effort was that they needed to have close cooperation with the Americans. The Americans were, after all, not just the emerging economic military superpower, but they also were an emerging scientific superpower. And unfortunately, prior to the war, efforts by the armed forces to develop some form of technical cooperation between the two countries resulted in a complete collapse of any efforts to do so, primarily caused by the fact that the British were absolutely convinced, their chauvinism convinced them, that the Americans had nothing to offer except perhaps the Norden bomb site, pictured here. Well, the Americans were equally convinced that British technology was a bunch of rubbish and absolutely refused to give the British the top secret Norden bomb site. When the war began, Tizard was given a new position as the scientific advisor to the Chief of Air Staff. And he advocated with the Chief of Air Staff and the Air Minister the need to send a technical scientific mission to the United States to start full-scale cooperation without any pre-advanced quid pro quo. But the Air Ministry was not interested in this proposal. It took Tizard months and months and months to convince them of its vital necessity. And it was only finally in early 1940 that the Chief of Air Staff told Tizard that it might be possible, but he had to be convinced that the Americans were, first of all, supportive of Great Britain, and secondly, had anything that could be of possible use to the British Armed Forces. As a result of this, Tizard determined that they should send a basically scientific intelligence mission to the United States to investigate. Tizard wanted to go himself, but the chief of air staff said, no, you're too valuable here. So Tizard turned to his friend A.V. Hill to lead this intelligence mission. In fact, to lead, he was the only member of this intelligence mission to be sent. Hill complicated the issue somewhat by getting elected as an MP for Cambridge University just prior to him going to the United States. The Foreign Office objected because politicians cannot be engaged in diplomatic missions, but eventually it was agreed that Hill would just play his role as a scientist and not as an MP, and Hill went to the United States in March 1940. There he met Philip Kerr, Lord Lothian, who was the British ambassador, and Lothian was a long-term advocate of Anglo-American cooperation. Hill toured the United States extensively, talking to leading academics and scientists, and quickly determined two things. First of all, the American elites were overwhelmingly in support of Great Britain's war against the Nazis. And secondly, that the Americans had a lot to offer the British, including, as Hill discovered, radar. An American scientist actually said to Hill during one meeting, I suppose you know we have a system of aircraft detection. And then he said, perhaps I shouldn't have told you that. Hill, from other evidence, realized this had to be radar, and he wrote, as did Lothian, advocating for a full-scale technical mission to be sent immediately. Unfortunately, of course, chaos was going on in Britain, probably even worse than the chaos you folks have recently had with your series of prime ministers. Of course, with the fall of France and the arrival of power of Winston Churchill. The problem was in London, Lindemann, who remained Churchill's principal scientific advisor, opposed any idea that he saw perceived from his rival had come from his rival Tizard. As well, Churchill, as the Britain was struggling to see if it could survive, was angry at the Americans for their failure to provide any concrete help to the British war effort. As a result, the idea of a technical mission to the United States was simply not acceptable to Churchill and to Lindemann. Without getting any response to his suggestions, on the 13th of June, 1940, Hill rushed back to Great Britain, where he began to personally advocate for a full-scale technical mission. The result of this was ultimately the sending of a mission to the United States. The reason the decision was finally made is, first of all, Tizard was basically removed from his positions of influence by Lindemann. Tizard lost his position of scientific advisor to the chief of air staff. So Lindemann now felt he could support a good idea because it was no longer Tizard's. And secondly, the Americans had begun to provide some help to the British, such as rifles, in June 1940. And Churchill was more inclined to allow a technical mission to proceed. And this was going to be a mission unlike any others before. It was go to the United States with a leading group of scientists and military technical experts, and they would take with them all of the latest British military technology. It would be a free and open exchange without any demands for quid pro quo. The hope was, by giving them everything, the Americans would reciprocate, and this would foster Anglo-American relations. Amongst the hardware that the mission brought was perhaps, as one American scientific historian called it, the most important cargo ever taken to America's shore, the cavity magnetron valve. And here is Tizard showing a cavity magnetron to two leading American scientists. This picture is actually not from 1940, but later. And this was the device that would transform Anglo-American technical cooperation and, in fact, the whole Allied war effort. Picture on the right is the only known picture of the Tizard mission. Everyone is present there, except for John Cockcroft, who was the second scientist sent with Tizard. Cockcroft is unfortunately taking the photograph in this picture. The Americans were overwhelmed by the British generosity and immediately began to reciprocate. The meeting came to its dramatic height when on September 19th, 1940, at a hotel room in Washington, the British revealed to the Americans the magnetron. The magnetron, a brand new invention, had just really been discovered in February and March 1940. And the mission was allowed to take one of the first 12 pre-production magnetrons to the Americans. This device made ultra shortwave or microwave radar possible. It made for much smaller radar sets and much more accurate radar sets than had previously been possible. And when the American civilian scientists who had been put in charge of microwave technologies by the American government saw this magnetron, they suddenly realized they could build a practical microwave radar. Tizard rushed home in the early days after this meeting to Great Britain to encourage the British government to immediately expand technical cooperation and put it on a permanent basis. Other scientists, including John Cockcroft, stayed in the United States, and there they had another profound impact. Not only did Tizard's work lead to the mobilization of British science, but also led to the mobilization of American science as well. Scientists, including Cockcroft and another radar expert on the mission, E.G. Taffy Bowen, were instrumental in assisting the Americans set up the basic foundations for what became known as the Radiation Laboratory, or the RAD Lab, at MIT. Very quickly, the RAD Lab would be the largest single radar research facility in the world. And by early 1942, just within weeks of the American entry into the war after Pearl Harbor, the Americans were already mass producing microwave radar, which proved to be one of the decisive weapons of the Second World War. So Hill and Tizard had accomplished their goals. They had mobilized British science for war. They had gotten British scientific opinion to understand the threat of Nazism. And while they couldn't achieve everything they wished to, primarily because Lindemann refused to consider a central scientific agency for controlling all British military civilian scientific research, as they would have in the United States, the two men had certainly ensured that British science would have been much more effectively used in the First World War. Hill, after his missions, primarily was involved with his political work, although he was also involved in a Royal Society committee trying to give government advice to try to thwart the often ill-advised advice Churchill was getting from Lindemann. Hill also continued his work with academic refugees. His major work in 1940-41 was to get academic refugees who had been interned by the British government in 1940 released from imprisonment on the Isle of Man. Tizard himself would not be allowed back into the upper echelons of British civil service science until after Churchill and therefore Lindemann were voted out of office by the British public. As a result, during the Second World War, Tizard served on a number of less important committees. He would only return to become again an important civilian scientific leader after the war ended. But the two men, instrumental in the mobilization of British science in the Second World War. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I hope the rest of the seminar goes well.